In the heart of a quiet Texas town, life moved at a steady pace. The mornings were filled with the hum of passing trucks, children playing under the sprawling oak trees, and the familiar chatter of neighbors who knew each other's lives like the back of their hands. It was a place where trust was sacred, where family bonds ran deep, and the sheriff's badge was a symbol of safety and respect. But behind the warm smiles and the tightly knit community, there was a storm quietly gathering. The sheriff, a man sworn to uphold the law, was about to face accusations that would shatter the very foundation of his family. And at the center of it all, a 15-year-old girl, a niece, a daughter, and to some, a victim of unimaginable betrayal. Her sudden withdrawal from school, her quiet demeanor, and the secret she carried with her would soon ripple through the town, leaving a trail of questions, heartbreak, and horror. How could such a scandal unfold in a place like this? And when the truth came to light, why did it end with the kind of violence that would haunt those who heard the story? This is a tale of trust broken, lives destroyed, and decisions made in the heat of raw emotion. The kind of story that makes you question how well you really know those closest to you. On the surface, they seemed like the perfect family, living the American dream in a town where everyone knew their name. A small, tight-knit community where trust wasn't just an ideal, it was a way of life. The sheriff, a man who had earned the respect of his colleagues and the trust of his town, held a position of honor. His badge wasn't just a symbol of law enforcement. It was a symbol of the protection he promised to those around him and the responsibility he carried each day with quiet dignity. His wife, Patricia, stood by him through the years, their marriage seemingly unbreakable. To the outside world, she was the picture of support and loyalty, the woman who balanced the responsibilities of their home while standing firmly beside her husband. A marriage built on love, on shared values, and on a family that had weathered its fair share of challenges. Together, they appeared to have it all. But it was the presence of their niece, Kelsey, who had recently moved in with them, that began to change the delicate balance they had all maintained. Kelsey, a 15-year-old girl with a quiet strength and big dreams, had always been close to her aunt and uncle. She was the type of girl who was loved by her teachers, respected by her peers, and adored by her family. Kelsey's presence in their home, however, was a quiet one. She didn't ask for much attention. She was content to let others lead while she focused on her studies and the future she envisioned for herself. But beneath the surface, there were whispers of growing tension that no one could quite put into words. Kelsey had her dreams, yes. She had aspirations of college, a career in the arts, and a future filled with possibilities. Yet behind her calm demeanor, there were struggles that no one could have anticipated. A child still so young, with a heart full of hopes and a mind that was still developing. At that age, life was still so new, and choices were still being made with an innocent lack of foresight. No one could have predicted that Kelsey's life would soon be overshadowed by the very people who were supposed to protect her. It was the sheriff's wife, Patricia, who would find herself in the eye of the storm, a storm that would unravel the life they had so carefully built. For now, they were just a family, living, loving, and hoping. But soon, things would change in a way no one could have possibly imagined. As the days went on, Kelsey's behavior began to change, imperceptibly at first, then more alarmingly. Those who had known her as a vibrant, driven young girl started to notice her growing isolation. Her once lively conversations at school grew quieter, her laughter less frequent. She started missing classes, avoiding her friends, and spending more time alone, often locked away in her room, where the walls seemed to close in around her. At first, her Aunt Patricia assumed it was the typical teenage phase, the rebellion, the desire for space, but soon the signs became too obvious to ignore. Kelsey, who had always been open and friendly, had become a shadow of her former self. Her demeanor was distant, her eyes hollow with a burden too heavy for someone her age. It wasn't long before Patricia noticed something even more troubling. There were subtle changes, small shifts that would have gone unnoticed in any other family, but not in this one. Kelsey's weight loss, the sudden weariness in her eyes, the quiet sobs she thought no one could hear. But when Patricia found the pregnancy test in the bathroom, everything came crashing down. A single, stark line, undeniable in its truth. Patricia didn't need to ask. The question hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Kelsey's secret was now exposed. The weight of that revelation shook the foundation of the family. But the questions didn't stop there. Patricia, a woman who had once believed she knew every part of her family, had to face the impossible truth. How could her niece be pregnant, and why had no one noticed sooner? But then came the confession, the one that would leave the entire town stunned. Kelsey, trembling with fear and shame, told the unthinkable. Her pregnancy was the result of an affair with her uncle, the man who wore the sheriff's badge with pride, the man who swore to protect and serve. The father of the child, the person Kelsey had turned to for comfort and guidance in her darkest moments, was none other than the very man who had sworn to uphold the law. The sheriff's betrayal was now laid bare, the very thing that would unravel everything he had worked for. A man of authority and power, a pillar of the community, now faced the most devastating accusation anyone could imagine. A scandal that would tear through the heart of the town, leaving no one untouched. How could it be possible? How could the man who everyone looked up to commit such a grievous act? One that not only shattered his own family, but also destroyed the very trust the community had placed in him. The story had only begun to unfold, but it was clear that this family would never be the same. Kelsey, trapped in a nightmare of her own making, and Patricia, left to deal with the unimaginable betrayal, now faced a future they had never anticipated. The sheriff, once the man of honor, would find himself thrust into a scandal that no amount of power or influence could erase. Patricia stood in the hallway, her hand gripping the doorframe, staring at her niece. The weight of Kelsey's confession hung heavy in the air, thick with disbelief and heartbreak. The world around her seemed to blur as the room seemed to close in, suffocating her. Kelsey's words echoed in her ears. He's the father. In those few words, Patricia's life as she knew it was shattered into pieces. Her husband, the man she had trusted for years, the father of her children, had crossed a line so vile, so incomprehensible, that it felt like a betrayal from the very core of her existence. Patricia could barely breathe, her heart racing, her hands trembling. She had been warned before, told by others that there were whispers around town about her husband's behavior, but she had never taken them seriously. He was the sheriff, a man of integrity, respected by all. How could this happen? How could he betray her in the most unimaginable way? The man who had sworn to protect their family, the man who had sworn to uphold the law, was the very one who had caused the most irreparable damage. And in the most twisted irony, the victim was the very person who had been placed under their roof, the child of her sister, the one she had cared for and watched grow. The silence in the room was deafening. Patricia's mind raced, the anger bubbling up like a storm she couldn't control. The woman she had been before, the loving, caring wife, seemed to slip away, replaced by someone who was unrecognizable, consumed by rage. Her hands shook as she grasped for something to anchor herself, but there was nothing. Nothing could fix this. Nothing could erase the humiliation, the shame, and the all-consuming fury she felt. Patricia's thoughts, once rational, now ran wild. What was she supposed to do? How could she face the town, her friends, her family? How could she look at the man who had sworn his love and loyalty to her every day for the last 20 years and not see the truth written all over his face? The betrayal had left her broken, and now there was a fire igniting inside her, a fury that could not be extinguished by mere words. The emotional breakdown came quickly. She couldn't sit still. She couldn't stop pacing, her mind trapped in a whirlwind of pain, anger, and confusion. She felt humiliated beyond words, violated by the person who was supposed to be her protector, her partner. Every room in their house now felt cold and foreign, as if it was no longer their home, but a prison where the truth loomed like an undeniable shadow. Patricia's emotions shifted rapidly: anger, rage, disbelief, and a thirst for revenge. She couldn't think straight, but what she did know was that she couldn't let her husband escape the consequences of his actions. The thought of him walking away scot-free, of him facing no repercussions for the life he had destroyed, was too much for her to bear. She began to hatch a plan, a way to make him feel the pain, the betrayal, that she had been forced to endure. Neighbors began to notice the shift in Patricia. Once a woman known for her quiet dignity and warmth, she now carried herself with a coldness, a venomous edge that could be felt even in the briefest of encounters. The constant tension was visible, not just in her interactions, but in the way she carried herself. Gone was the soft-spoken woman who once smiled at every passing face. Now, she was a woman on the edge, ready to explode at any moment. Her reactions became unpredictable. She would lash out at her children, angry for no apparent reason, and in the next moment, she would break down into tears, grieving the family that had once been whole. She would catch herself staring at family photos, her wedding rings on her finger, wondering how she could ever look at them the same way again. Each passing day seemed to unravel her further, as the anger inside her consumed every corner of her being. And in those moments of solitude, when no one was watching, Patricia began to make plans. The kind of plans no one could have imagined a woman like her capable of. She began to prepare herself for what lay ahead, the confrontation, the reckoning that would come. For the first time in years, Patricia was willing to do whatever it took to make sure the truth was heard. No longer would she be silent. No longer would she be a victim of her husband's betrayal. It was late that night when the storm finally broke. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now stood quiet, eerily still in the darkness. Inside, Patricia had reached the point of no return. She couldn't escape the thoughts that haunted her, the feeling that her life had been turned upside down in the cruelest way imaginable. And there, in the same house, sat the girl, the niece she had once lovingly taken in, the same girl who had shattered her world. Kelsey was in the kitchen when Patricia approached. No words were exchanged, but there was a tension between them that thickened the air, as if everything had been building toward this moment, the final confrontation that would change everything. Patricia's eyes were cold, a hard expression settling over her face. Kelsey, on the other hand, looked defeated, perhaps afraid, or perhaps just numb. The truth of the situation had already taken root in her, but it was still too much for either of them to comprehend fully. Patricia spoke first, her voice low but sharp, like the edge of a knife. "How could you do this?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of pain and anger. Kelsey didn't respond at first. There was nothing she could say. What could she possibly say to explain the unexplainable? What words could heal the wounds that had been torn open by her own actions? The silence between them was deafening. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the tension. Then, with a sudden burst of emotion, Patricia took a step forward. Her voice cracked. "You think you can just destroy everything we've built?" She wasn't speaking just to Kelsey anymore. Her words were aimed at the man who had once been her partner in life, the man who had betrayed her in the most unforgivable way. The anger in Patricia's eyes was unmistakable. She was a woman pushed beyond her limits, a woman whose grief had transformed into something much darker, something driven by vengeance. Kelsey, for a brief moment, seemed to shrink under the weight of her aunt's fury, her shoulders slumping as though trying to make herself smaller. But then the words came. "I never wanted this," Kelsey muttered, her voice barely a whisper. That was enough to set Patricia off. The rage, long bubbling beneath the surface, finally exploded. She lunged toward Kelsey, grabbing her by the wrist, pulling her toward the living room. The two women struggled, a whirlwind of anger and desperation clashing in the dimly lit space. Kelsey's voice, pleading now, filled the room. "Please don't. I never asked for this." But Patricia wasn't listening. The raw emotion in her was overpowering, and it consumed her. What started as a heated argument quickly turned violent. The rage, the hurt, and the betrayal that had been festering in Patricia for days, weeks, maybe even months, came rushing to the surface. Kelsey tried to push her off, but Patricia's grip was unrelenting. The sounds of the struggle echoed through the house. The harsh shoves, the cries, the desperation of both women caught in a moment that neither of them could have imagined. At some point, everything turned chaotic. A loud crash. The room seemed to blur, the shadows distorting into something unfamiliar, almost unrecognizable. Patricia, in a moment of blind fury, grabbed something, perhaps a sharp object, something heavy, but no one could remember clearly. It was as if the house itself had swallowed the truth of that moment. What followed was not something anyone could have prepared for. A single cry rang out, sharp and full of terror, before everything went silent. The aftermath was a blur of confusion and panic. Patricia stood over her niece, the chaos still hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The house seemed frozen in time. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, save for the weight of what had just happened. Kelsey lay motionless on the floor, her face pale, her body twisted in a way that made it clear there would be no recovery from the violence that had just unfolded. In those next few moments, Patricia's mind raced. What had she done? Could she undo it? Could she fix this? But there was no going back. The severity of the situation hit her like a wave, the reality of her actions sinking in with terrifying clarity. She stumbled backward, her hands trembling, her heart racing. For a brief moment, she simply stood there, not knowing what to do or where to go. Her mind, clouded with a mix of emotions, grief, guilt, anger, fought to regain control, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The silence that followed was suffocating. As the minutes dragged on, Patricia seemed to snap back into some semblance of awareness. The first thing she did was reach for the phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she dialed the one number that could change everything. The sheriff's office. The man she had once loved, the man who had torn their lives apart, would now be the one to face the consequences of his actions. But even as she called for help, a strange, unsettling feeling washed over her. The house, her home, no longer felt like a place of safety. It had become something else entirely, something cold, something unforgiving. And as the flashing lights of emergency vehicles appeared outside, signaling the end of one life and the beginning of another tragedy, Patricia stood frozen, wondering if this was really the end of her story, or just the beginning of something much worse. The investigation into Kelsey's death would begin the very next day, but no one could have known then just how tangled the web of deceit would become. No one could have predicted the twists, the lies, and the confessions that would follow, as the truth, if there was even such a thing, slowly began to unravel. By the time the flashing lights of the police vehicles illuminated the darkened street, it was already too late. The damage had been done, and the once peaceful neighborhood was now at the center of a tragedy so shocking that the ripple effects would be felt for years. As officers arrived at the scene, the quiet, empty house stood in stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just hours before. The crime scene was now a cold, haunting display of what had happened. Evidence markers dotted the floor, each one pointing to something left behind in the wake of the violence. A broken vase, an overturned chair, and the unmistakable signs of a struggle in the living room where the confrontation had escalated. As the forensic team worked tirelessly, cataloging every detail, there was an unsettling sense that the full picture was still far from complete. Neighbors, many of whom had once waved hello to Patricia and Kelsey on their walks through the quiet neighborhood, stood in small clusters on the street corner, their faces a mix of disbelief and concern. They spoke in hushed tones, struggling to make sense of the horror that had unfolded in a house just yards away from where they stood. Some remembered hearing loud voices, others saw the flashing lights and hurried to their windows, but no one had been able to intervene before it was too late. The local sheriff's office was quick to respond, but there was something almost too familiar about the scene for the officers who arrived first. The lead investigator, Officer Thomas, had known Patricia for years. He had seen her at community events, knew the family, and even worked closely with the sheriff. There was a certain unease in his voice when he was asked to handle the case, a silent acknowledgement that he was walking into a situation that would test his professional resolve. As the investigation unfolded, the first statements from neighbors began to trickle in. Most of them spoke about how quiet the couple had seemed in the days leading up to the incident. There were whispers, yes, there always are in small towns, but no one had suspected anything out of the ordinary. Then came the statements from family members. Patricia's sister, deeply distraught, could barely speak when asked about the nature of the relationship between her sister and niece. "They were close," she said, choking back tears, "but I don't know what happened." The lack of clarity in her words only deepened the mystery of what led to the deadly confrontation. The most telling testimony, however, came from Patricia herself. As soon as the police arrived, she was immediately taken into custody. She was still in the house, standing in the kitchen, staring blankly at the floor. When officers approached her, she seemed almost unaware of the gravity of the situation, as if she were trapped in a fog of disbelief and horror. Her first words were chilling in their detachment. "She's gone. I didn't mean for it to happen," Patricia murmured, almost in a whisper, as though speaking to no one in particular. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but there was something unsettling in the way she spoke, almost as if she were removed from the reality of what she had done. The forensic team worked relentlessly, gathering evidence piece by piece. The pathologist's report would later confirm what was already becoming evident. Kelsey had been attacked with a blunt object, but the extent of the violence was shocking. Bruises on her arms and neck told the story of a desperate fight for survival. However, what truly caught the attention of investigators was the evidence that tied Patricia to the scene. There were traces of blood on Patricia's clothes. Her own blood, yes, but also Kelsey's. It was clear that she had been in close proximity to her niece during the attack, and that her hands had played a direct role in what happened that night. More disturbing still was the discovery of a shattered cell phone near Kelsey's body. Upon investigation, it became clear that the phone had been used in the hours leading up to the crime. A series of texts between Kelsey and Patricia had been exchanged, filled with messages that seemed to foreshadow the explosive confrontation to come. Some messages were pleading, others threatening, but they painted a picture of a family in turmoil. A neighbor, who had lived next door for over a decade, came forward with a crucial piece of information. She reported that, earlier that evening, she had seen Patricia leaving the house with an object in her hand. Something large, perhaps a bat or pipe. The neighbor didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it was just part of an evening routine. But in hindsight, she realized that it was far from ordinary. As the investigation dug deeper, even more unsettling facts came to light. There was the matter of the sheriff himself. Though initially unaware, the authorities soon found that he had been involved in an extramarital affair with Kelsey, a relationship that no one had suspected, but which had cast a shadow over the entire family dynamic. All the while, Patricia remained stoic, almost eerily calm, as the evidence mounted against her. The conflicting emotions she displayed, grief, guilt, and at times a disturbing lack of emotion, only added to the complexity of the case. Was she truly remorseful, or was she hiding something deeper? The most damning evidence, however, came from the sheriff's office. Officers discovered a series of audio recordings on Kelsey's phone, documenting private conversations between the girl and her aunt. Some of the recordings contained Kelsey's tearful confessions, describing her fear of what might happen if the truth came out. Others revealed her attempts to reconcile with her aunt, to apologize for the damage that had already been done. As the investigation into the crime continued, it became clear that what had initially seemed like a simple act of rage had unfolded into a tragic and complex story of betrayal, family secrets, and untold lies. And while the town continued to grapple with the horror of the events, there were still many questions left unanswered. Why had Patricia acted with such brutal force? Was this truly the result of a fleeting moment of anger, or had it been years of pent-up resentment finally reaching a breaking point? The answers, it seemed, were as elusive as the truth itself. A once-respected sheriff, a family that had been the cornerstone of a community, now torn apart by lies, deceit, and betrayal. A young life, full of promise and potential, stolen far too soon. Kelsey Turner had barely begun to live, and yet, her life had ended in a way that no one could have imagined. The horrifying chain of events that had begun with a forbidden relationship, escalated by passion, rage, and betrayal, had culminated in a tragedy that no one could ever undo. The story of Patricia Turner, the woman whose actions shattered the lives of so many, is a haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked emotions. In her quest for revenge, for justice in her own eyes, she crossed a line that, once crossed, could never be undone. The act of violence, once a tragic blur in the heat of anger, left ripples that affected everyone around her: her husband, her family, her community, and most of all, Kelsey. But justice, as it often does, came with a price. While Patricia was convicted, her sentence a clear consequence of her actions, it did little to heal the broken hearts and shattered trust left in the wake of her crime. The community, once united in their admiration for the sheriff's family, now stood divided. The whispers of betrayal spread like wildfire. Who could they trust now? And what would happen to a town that had once felt so safe, now haunted by its own memories? Justice had been served in a courtroom, but what about the justice of the heart? Was the family, shattered beyond recognition, truly able to heal? Could they ever reconcile the love they once had for Patricia with the horror of her crime? For the residents of this once peaceful town, the unanswered questions lingered in the air like an unsolved riddle. What had truly driven Patricia to this dark edge? Was it love, rage, or something far deeper, something perhaps no one would ever fully understand? As time went on, the town's streets grew quieter. The place that had once felt full of life, full of possibility, now seemed draped in an eerie silence. There were no more joyful gatherings, no more sense of unity. Only the lingering memories of what had once been, and the tragic events that had reshaped everything. The small town, forever scarred by its connection to a crime so shocking, could never return to what it once was. And Kelsey's absence was felt everywhere. In the empty school halls, the abandoned playgrounds, and the homes where the light once shone brightly, there was now a void. A place where once the future had seemed so certain, now nothing but an empty space remained. Her family, her friends, and the community, forever mourning the loss of the life that could have been. This case remains a chilling reminder of how the heart can turn dark, how betrayal and unchecked emotions can lead to unspeakable tragedy. It leaves behind a trail of questions, answers forever out of reach. In the quiet after the storm, there is only reflection. Only the need to understand how something that seemed so far removed from the everyday could come crashing down in such a violent and final way. And yet, in the end, it is not the case itself that stands as the most unsettling part of this story. It is the realization that even the most familiar, trusted people can hide a darkness within. A darkness that, once unleashed, can forever alter the lives of those around them. What do you think really happened in this case? Was justice truly served? Or were there elements of this story that still remain hidden in the shadows? We want to hear your thoughts. Share them with us in the comments below. Is there more to this story than meets the eye? Join the conversation and be part of a growing community exploring the darkest corners of true crime. And if you want to stay up to date with more gripping cases like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a chilling new update, because the truth is out there, waiting to be uncovered.